Okay, so this is Michelle from Seams Like Quilting, and I'm going to talk a little bit about really strongly printed fabric. It can feel really intimidating a lot of the times. This is the Dapper Dan collection from Rae Ritchie, and I'm super excited about this. We saw this at market, and it's so adorable. And the first, some of the first things we saw were these cute like animals with tea and with these little like vignettes, right? And this is the kind of fabric that people look at and think, oh, I'll fussy cut that, or I can make that into this, that, and the other thing. But it can intimidate some people in terms of how to use it in like a more patterned quilt top. So we're actually going to make a shop sample out of this with Decostitch, which has these 4.5-inch squares in it. And so I did not fussy cut this fabric. I was a little bit more mindful when I cut this fabric. So that's kind of what I want to show you today. You can see that I didn't fussy cut it to perfectly take this vignette and like center it. And I did cut off people's heads, and there's random feet here and there. But when you put this in like the context of a whole quilt, you're really not going to notice those kinds of things. But you will see the cute fabric. So what you want to look for when you're looking at fabric like this is you want to look for a pattern that has pieces in it that are big enough to show off the fabric and make it really special. But you don't have to get all that extra yardage and do all of that trouble to fussy cut it perfectly, so that, because if I had fussy cut this in a traditional sense, then this little fox, his tail wouldn't be cut off, the whole thing would be over a little bit, and that would be kind of what people would do. But because Rae Ritchie's fabrics and the way this fabric is designed, there isn't a whole lot of room around the vignettes. You can see like the tail crosses over with the foot here, and so you really can't cut it so that there isn't like a piece of the vignette next to it included. And you are going to lose some of the figures in the seam, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. You can still work with some really cute fabric and really cute patterns and really show them off without worrying about doing that. So we've got 4.5-inch squares out of the main fabric, and then we have this medallion fabric with these heads and faces on it. We're going to do some 4.5-inch squares out of this. Now the pattern calls for 1/4 yard, and then to cut that 1/4 yard into two 4.5-inch strips. Well, if you are mathing with me, 1/4 yard is 9 inches, which means that I would get exactly what I needed at the shop in order to make the cuts that are required in the pattern. But you only need 10 4.5-inch squares. So that you don't need to use the fullness of those two strips. The other thing to understand is that if you are going to go with a more heavily patterned fabric, all you have to do is get just a little bit extra fabric. Here we have 1/3 of the yard instead of 1/4. And the reason we did that is just so that we got just that little bit extra, so I could be a little bit more mindful when I make my first 4.5-inch cut. Because if I were to just go with the cut edge here and do 4.5 inches, that's right here, I would be cutting off right along this line. So I would get this medallion, and I could maybe cut it so that this medallion was in the center of my 4.5-inch square. But I'm actually going to get more if I have this line, you see? So when I cut this, if I cut it like this, I'm going to get the rabbits, and then I'm going to cut the foxes and the frogs in half, and then I'm going to get rabbits again. Well, I don't want to do that. I want to have more variety and use more of this really cool, just what I think is absolutely beautiful fabric of these Victorian dressed animals doing all kinds of things. So I am going to cut that first 4.5 inches because then it kind of centers the rabbit. But then what I'm going to do before I cross cut that into my 4.5-inch squares, but then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look here, and I don't want another with just the rabbit. So if all I did was just a little mindful here, and I trimmed off, it looks like I'm going to trim off about 1.5 inches. And I'm going to save that in my scrap bin of that. Now my 4.5 inches, I actually have the mouse centered, and I also have most of this frog. Now I have enough left over that if I'd rather have the frog centered, I could do that. And actually that's what I'm going to do, because the frog, totally my favorite. So I'm going to cut another inch off here. Now, it may seem like I'm wasting fabric, and technically I am because I'm saving this for my scrap bin. However, the thing to remember when you have this super cool fabric is there's a reason that you liked it and you want to highlight the parts that you really liked. So now, when I cut my 4.5 inches, I have another strip for the scrap bin. And now I have these frogs roughly in the middle. And now I have these roughly in the middle. So when I cross cut my 4.5 inch squares, I don't have to be super specific about it, but I can cross cut my 4.5 inch squares in a way that will allow me to keep that medallion pretty much together. Now, the reason I can do this with this fabric and I didn't do it with this one is because there's not a really clear defined limit from the foreground to the background in this fabric, but there very much is here with the white kind of egg shape and the blue filigree around it. So I'm able to make this. And again, I'm not fully fussy cutting this. Full fussy cutting requires all kinds of measurements and this and that and the other thing. All I'm doing is I'm just kind of eyeballing through my ruler. And I am going to double check the back. And I'm going to cut these one at a time. I'm not going to cut these like that. I'm going to cut these one at a time. And again, I only need 10, so I'm not going to use the whole strip of both whole strips. But if I do this, you can see that even though I'm not being super careful, I'm just cutting my regular old 4.5 inch squares, each time, because of the repeat of the fabric, that bunny is roughly in the middle. And so when I'm actually putting this together, the bunny is going to be highlighted. And I'm super excited about that because that's kind of what I wanted out of this fabric. And that's why we picked the pattern that we picked. So if you have fabric that you're absolutely in love with, but you can't figure out what to do with it, that's what we're there for. That's what we're at the shop for. We're there to help you kind of find a fabric or a pattern that's going to show off your fabric, or a fabric that's going to show off your pattern, whichever one you like to start with, or whichever kind of way you go. But it can be really intimidating, these more heavily patterned, especially with figurative fabrics, these more heavily patterned figures can feel a little bit more intimidating. So it's not fussy cutting. It's kind of somewhere in between. I would call it mindful cutting, but that's how you really handle this kind of more heavily patterned fabric with these figurative things in it that you really want to highlight in a quilt without like making like all of the frogs are cut in half, right? Which does get, frankly, a little gruesome in the end. So again, this is Michelle with Seams Like Quilting. Thank you so much. And we will have this. Again, this is Dapper Dan from Rae Ritchie. Yeah, Rae Ritchie is the designer. And we're just super excited about this. Dear Stella is the manufacturer that I was having a brain fart there. Dear Stella is the manufacturer on this, and I'm super excited about this. I love Rae Ritchie. I've always loved her designs. This is the first time we've brought a Rae Ritchie collection into the shop, and so I'm really hoping that people love these little guys as much as I do, because every single one of them, I just want to put them in my pocket and take them home. Thank you, everybody, and good luck.